reality, captured in user-friendly symbols and processed for understanding. The Idea Channel.
Terrible conditions. Contrary to Ashton's thesis, the conditions in Chicago were worse than they had been in Lodge, not the other way around, because we had no heat.
We can start any time.
Well, you signal me when you want to start. Well, Dr. von Hayek, it's a pleasure to see you after years of reading you and indeed listening to you. I was one of the auditors of a course you gave at the London School of Economics many, many years ago. Tell me, did you begin in your intellectual life as an adult, did you begin as a Fabian? Were you a socialist?
Yes.
Were you an Adam Smith man?
No. See, you could describe it as a Fabian, of course. Well, there were, in fact, Fabians in Austria too, but I didn't know them. The influence which led me to economics was really Walter Rathenau's conception of a planned economy. He had himself been the raw material dictator in Germany and wrote some very persuasive books about the reconstruction after the war. And they are, of course, socialist of a sort, central planning at least, not a proletarian socialism, and were very persuasive indeed. And I found that really to understand that I had to study economics. The first two books of economics, which I read while I was in the fighting in Italy, were so bad that I'm still surprised they didn't put me permanently off economics. But when I got back to Vienna, somebody put me on to Karl Menger, and that caught me definitely.
Had you read the English economists, the classical economists?
At that time, not. Adam Smith I read fairly early, but the only one. And in a German translation, you see. English is really the third foreign language I learned. It's now the only one I can speak. But I was tortured all my childhood being taught French, irregular verbs and nothing else, and consequently never learned to speak it really. I picked up Italian during the war in Italy. Well, sort of Italian, a Venetian dialect. I don't dare to speak.
Very different from the rest of it.
I don't dare to speak it in polite society.
Quite so, quite
and
so.
that gave me the confidence to take up English, and ultimately, of course, I really learned it when I was a young man. After my degree, I went to the United States, and my first experience was American English in New York in 1923 and 24.
I didn't know you'd come to the United States that early.
It was before the time of the Rockefeller Foundation. It was my own risk and expense, and I arrived in New York in March 1923 with $25 in my pocket, with a series of letters of recommendation by Schumpeter, which each earned me a lunch and nothing else.
Had you known Schumpeter in Vienna?
Not really, but he was the one. He was a visiting professor at Columbia before the war. So when Mises and Wiese learned that I wanted, they sent me to Schumpeter, who was then the chairman of that bank. He had just been Minister of Finance, and he was chairman. And he equipped me with a number of letters, ministerial size, which I had to get a separate folder to carry them to America. And I delivered them all, so I met all the famous old economists, and they all were very kind to me, but did nothing. I'd gone over there for promise of a job by Jeremiah W. Jenks, the head trust specialist.
Yes.
But when I arrived, he was away on holiday, so I ran out of money. And I told that story already here. I then was greatly relieved that the very morning I was to start as a dishwasher in 6th Avenue restaurant. Telephone call came, Jenks had returned. He was willing to. I have since bitterly regretted that I cannot say I started my career in America.
Now you say you began as a Fabian socialist under the influence of Walter Rathenau. in those days, of course, this was a kind of an intellectual socialism,
very
and
much
you
so.
mentioned the fact it wasn't proletarian. Did it interest you that so many of the German, Russian, Austrian intellectuals were the ones who became the Marxists, not the masses? It was an intellectual movement that spread with enormous.
Oh, enormous. But see, I spent my university days already arguing with these my opponents were Marxists and Freudians.
Oh, yes.
And we had endless discussions, and it was really what I thought the poverty of the arguments of the Marxists which turned me against socialism.
I see.
And incidentally, I'll let you another thing. Both the Marxists and the Freudians had the dreadful habit of insisting that theories were irrefutable.
Yes.
They are logically absolutely cogent. And that led me to see that a theory which cannot be refuted is not scientific.
Yes.
And that made me later embrace Popper when he had spelled this same idea out, which he had gained in the same experience. He was a few years younger, so we didn't know each other. But we both went through this experience, arguing all the time with Marxists and Freudians.
And they were both ideologists of a very strong sort.
Oh, very strong, and both all very good arguers. I mean, they're very anxious to discuss.
They also had, I think, the power of an evangelical movement and a humane movement. And by this I mean that those of us who listened to you and read you or studied under people like Jacob Viner or Frank Knight or Lionel Robbins always had to come to terms with the fact that the system, the free market system, whatever you want, was not humane. And that we felt that the society had to undertake something. Remember, this was depression, and we were seeing unemployment and poverty and banks failing and people scared and people killing themselves because their earnings had been wiped out. And when the New Deal came along, it seemed that here was the humane answer. And indeed, my parents, who were socialists, stopped voting socialist, even though they liked and loved Norman Thomas, and began to vote for Roosevelt. And we all felt that at last government had developed a, quote, heart. Did any of this make...
Oh, well, I didn't see it that way, but of course it tallies completely with what I'm doing at the moment. You may be amused that a few days ago, before I was returning the last volume of Law, Legislation and Liberty for being printed, I inserted one sentence into it, and it runs, "Man was civilized very much against his wishes." I mean, it's really the innate instincts which are coming out.
That's a very Freudian statement.
In a way, well,
Yes.
it's Freudian and anti-Freudian, because Freud, of course, wanted to relieve us of these repressions, and my argument is that by these repressions we became civilized.
Well, his whole point is that civilization is the repression of guilt, and that without that you can't have
in
none.
his old age, of course,
And the
when he wrote,
repression of aggression, of hostility. And so on.
when he wrote the Civilization and his discontent, he was
Yes.
already getting upset by what his pupils were making of his original ideas.
Quite so. I was interested that your works in the last 10 years have become, or have returned to a much more social philosophical scale than your earlier works. Well, let's start with the earlier ones. You created a furor in the United States, England, and I imagine around the world with The Road to Serfdom, because it came out at a time when you were a lone voice speaking in the wilderness about the terrible dangers which were inherent in turning over to government, even good government, even by good and well-intentioned people, powers which were both dangerous and inexorable. If you were to write that book over again, first, would you make any changes? And secondly, what would you call it?
Well, I suppose I would still call it the same, although I was never quite happy with the title, which I really adopted for sound, because I The idea came from Tocqueville, who speaks about the road to servitude.
Yes.
And I would like to have chosen the title, but it doesn't sound well for a
Yes.
title. So I changed servitude into serfdom for merely phonetic reasons.
Had it occurred to you since then that this was one reason that there was so much vicious response? Because the English and the Americans could not believe that they were in danger of becoming serfs. It
But
seemed
see,
unthinkable.
There wasn't a vicious reaction in England. In fact, the English socialists, or most of them, had all themselves become a little apprehensive already.
That
by
early?
the time. Oh yes. The book was received in England in the spirit in which I meant it to be understood as a serious argument. In fact, let me tell you one story. Barbara Wooden, who wrote one book against me, told me, you know, I had been on the point of writing a rather similar book, but you have now so overstated the case that I have to turn against you.
She said you had overstated the case
against socialism, and
planning.
the United States reception was completely different.
I see.
Of course, it came here at the height of the enthusiasm for the New Deal.
Sure.
All the intellectuals had just discovered their new great ideal, and the extent to which I was abused here, worst incidentally by men who had been my colleague at the London
Herman
School.
Feiner. I think that's the most savage book I've ever read
But
by
there's
an
a comic
intellectual.
part, I think I can now tell you the story behind it. Herman Feiner had come to hate the London School of Economics, and in particular Harold Laski, because when he had come to the United States and war broke out, he asked for leave and extension of leave, and that was denied him, because he was needed for teaching. And he was so upset about this that he turned against the London School of Economics, and particularly Lasky. And then so happened that I was the first member of the London School of Economics on which he could release all his hatred of the place. So I had to suffer for Harold Lasky.
I am horrified to hear you adopt so simple a psychological point of view.
No, it was
May I suggest
contributory.
another point? It takes a good deal of sophistication and poise to accept a system which is full of apparent paradoxes. The socialist system is very persuasive and very simple to explain to people. The government will take care of making sure that resources are sensibly, rationally distributed,
Oh, sure.
that people will get what they deserve, there will be no unemployment, there will be no war, there will be no depression. The system that you have described, and that actually is in the great tradition of economics, is one which demands a very high degree of equilibrium in the presence not only of complexity, but of apparent indifference to human happiness. That is, profits are wicked and cruel. Workers are exploited. Imperialism, the search for profits, brings war. And the evidence seems visible. What I'm trying to suggest is that people like Feiner and many political scientists and sociologists were reacting to what they believed or felt threatened by as an intellectual performance of great complexity which, quote, ignored the human problems of the time. Is this
You
correct?
know, we're coming up to what I'm doing at the moment. In fact, what I'm writing at the moment is called the reactionary character of the socialist conception. My argument there is essentially that our instincts were all formed in the small face-to-face society where we were taught and our instincts formed to serve visible needs of other people. Now, the big society was built up by our obeying signals which enabled us to serve unknown persons and to use unknown resources for that purpose. It became a purely abstract thing. Now, our instinct still is we want to see whom we do good, and we want to join with our immediate fellows in serving common purposes. Now, both these things are incompatible with a great society. The great society became possible instead of aiming at known needs of known people to be guided by the abstract signals of prices and no longer working for the same purposes with your friends, but following your own purposes. Both things are, according to our instincts, still very bad. And this bad things which have built up the modern society.
May I ask you to comment on the fact that it isn't the instinct, because we have been raised that way, and I don't think that instincts vary very much according to how you're raised, except in intensity, but that the fact that the need of people to have some kind of religious structure, now you can qualify the word religion, some scale of what is good and what is evil,
Yes, yes.
some scale of what is worth and not worth living for. Our Judeo-Christian tradition tells us, love thy neighbor. Am I my brother's keeper? And as you very shrewdly pointed out, we start with family as a little society in which we take care of each other, and the mother gives food from her plate to the child, or says to the child, now don't be greedy, give a little to so-and-so. Just because you're older and stronger does not mean that you have a right to it. And the whole structure of a religiously supported and religiously cemented social system is involved when you come to deal with...
Exactly, but it's very characteristic that it refers to the neighbor, the known fellow man.
Yeah.
And our society is built on the fact that we serve people whom we do not know.
Roosevelt was shrewd enough to say to Latin America, we shall be your good neighbors.
Yes.
We want to be good neighbors.
Okay.
He didn't realize he was confirming Hayek. But how do you respond to this? Do you find that in societies which have a different religious structure or a different ethos, that it is permissible to run the society without such values? Or that power is and of itself sufficient?
Well, that's a very long story. I almost hesitate to talk about it. After all, we had succeeded. So long as the great mass of the people were all earning their living in the market, either as heads of a household or of a small shop and so on, everybody learned and unquestionably accepted that what had evolved, is what you might call the capitalist ethic, of course much older than capitalism, the ethics of the market. It's only with the growth of the large organizations an ever-increasing part of the population no longer is brought up in that ethic. And at the same time, as it no longer learned the traditional ethics of the market, the philosophers were suddenly telling them, oh, you must not accept any ethical rules which are not rationally justifiable. And these two different effects, no longer learning the traditional ethics and actually being told by the philosophers, it's all nonsense, you ought not to accept any rules which you do not see have a visible purpose, led to the present situation, which only is 150 years, and the beginning of it is 150 years ago. Before that, there was never any serious revolt against the market society because every farmer knew he had to sell his grain.
Do you think that Marx, who was not alone and who, after all, had his own predecessors, first of all, his misreading of history was always to me so astonishing, even when I first read him, when he suggests, in effect, that all wars are carried on for purposes of profit as part of the profit-making system. And all you had to do is pick up a map of the world and look at the ferocity and the horrors of wars in the East, say, or in Africa, or a history book on the religious wars, which were very, very much worse, and so on. It is interesting that he captured, and that his disciples then captured, a kind of an umbrella. All of our troubles. They did not distinguish society from a capitalist society. They did not distinguish the group from a capitalist group. They found a convenient way of saying to people, the reason you are miserable or inadequate or short or weak is because this system has been so unjust. And this appeal then, not so much to the Germans as to the Russians, was then implemented by, to me, one of the great tragic disasters of the human race, Lenin, who taught Hitler.
Oh, I'm sure, yes, you're perfectly right. Well, you see, I think the intellectual history of all this is frightfully complex, because this idea of necessary laws of historical development appeared at the same time in Hegel and Kant. And you had two philosophical traditions, Hegelian idealism and French positivism, really aiming at a science which was supposed to discover necessary laws of historical development, which is called purely pseudoscience for many reasons. But it caught the imagination. And not only the imagination, it pleased certain traditional feelings and emotions. I mean, as you said before, once you put it out, the market society does not satisfy our instincts. And once people became aware of this and were not from childhood taught that these rules of the market are essential, because they revolted against it.
The interesting thing is the unawareness that people can have about the impersonal consequences of a system. My own intellectual history was enormously affected by the book that you edited, in which you have a chapter, Capitalism and the Historians. Now, that's a remarkable book because, in effect, what it says is that all that my generation had been taught about the horrors of the Industrial Revolution, based almost entirely on the work of the Hammonds,
Yes.
that this was a terribly incorrect and a terribly superficial statement, and that I think it was Ashton who points out that, of course, if you went into the slums of London and saw the poverty there, you thought these people were poorly off, but they thought they were very well off. And he quotes the letters of the clergymen who would come to visit London and say, I just saw the Jenkins, isn't it marvelous? Only last year they were starving in the ditches and sleeping in the barns and had no shoes. Their children now are shod and go to school, and so on and so on.
Well, I've long believed that misery becoming visible, not appearing for the first time, but being drawn to the attention of the urban population was really the cause, even of an improvement of the status of the poorest class. But so long as
You
they
mean
lived
it improved the status of the privileged classes?
Good, but see, that the people who lived so miserably in town were really had been drawn to the town because they were so much better off than they had been before.
Yes.
You mentioned this book which I edited, again, as in the former instance of the one on collectivist economic planning. It was that I found the general public just did not know of most important work which was being done by the historian. In this case, it was not only Ashton, but Hutt's.
That's right.
Hutt's study of the early industrialization and the misrepresentation by certain, in fact, partly parliamentary commissions in inquiring into the state of the poor, which for purely political reasons had distorted the real facts.
Have you ever run across a book by a young Cambridge graduate called Prelude to Imperialism?
I've only seen the title, no, I don't know the book.
That's an extraordinary book because it's in the tradition of Ashton and Hutt. But what he did was to examine the letters of the Christian missionaries who went to Africa, the letters back to their societies. And what emerges is as startling a transformation of our impressions of what went on in Africa as the one dealing with the Industrial Revolution. The most exploited group in Africa were the wives of the missionaries. They worked much harder than the natives because they had to teach them their own language and make a vocabulary and sing the psalms, but raise the vegetables and be the nurses and the doctors and settle the quarrels.
I can quite believe it, never occurred to me.
But the book is full of extraordinary examples of what I like to say are the non-visible and much more significant consequences. For example, if you were to take 90% of the graduating students of the colleges of the United States and ask them what a bank or a banker does, what percentage do you think would answer to your satisfaction.
Hardly any.
Yet they have all been exposed to banks, bankers, economics, and professors. How many of them would know what an executive does?
Well, that is extraordinarily difficult to explain, you know. That I know from my own experience. In the business school are doing quite a good job, but the economic students know nothing about it.
The ignorance of people about the things they vote about is, of course, very depressing. The feeling that one must temper one's disillusionment with the fact that these are very complicated, and to utter a heresy, not all people are intelligent. And you run into the problem of what the fate of a democracy will be when the crises become more acute and depend on more technical signals, to use your word, or information, to use mine.
Well, I'm very pessimistic about this. You see, my concern has increasingly become that we call democracy a system in which it isn't really the opinion of the majority which governs. It's a necessity of paying off any number of special interests. And unless we change the organization of our democratic system, democracy will I believe in democracy as a system of peaceful change of government. But that's all its whole advantage, there's no other. It just makes it possible to get rid of a government we dislike. But the omnipotent democracy which we have is not going to last long. And what I fear is people will be so disgusted with democracy that even they will abandon its good features. And
if you had magical powers and were to set about restructuring the system, a friend of mine, in making a witticism, prompted me to retort by saying, "That's a good rule. Let's pass a law that for every law that Congress passes, it must simultaneously repeal 20 others."
20 others, yes. Okay.
At least 20? But what would you do?
In the long run, the only chance is to alter our constitutional structure and have no omnipotent single representative assembly, but divides the powers on the traditional idea of a separation of powers, have one which is confined to true legislation in the sense of general rules of conduct, and the other governmental assembly being under the laws laid down by the first unable to discriminate, the second in consequence being unable to take any coercive action except to enforce general laws. Because the present system, I believe Schumpeter is right in the sense that while socialism can never satisfy what people expect, our present political structure inevitably drives us into socialism, even if people do not want it in their majority. And that can only be prevented by altering the structure of our so-called democratic system. But this is not necessarily a very, very slow process, and I don't think that an effort towards reform will come in time. So I rather fear that we shall have a return to some sort of dictatorial democracy, I would say, where democracy merely serves to authorize the action of a dictator, and the system is going to break down. It will be a very long period before a real democracy can re-emerge.
2 points, if I may. The Schumpeter book, I assume you mean Socialism, Capitalism, Democracy, which was to be a stupendous piece of work, makes the horrifying point that capitalism will be destroyed because of its successes.
In a way, it's true.
Would you comment on that?
Well, the capitalism has, of course, raised expectations which it cannot fulfill. And unless we take from government the powers to meet the demands of particular groups which are raised by its success, I think it will destroy itself. But it applies both to capitalism and democracy.
Does it strike you as ironic that perhaps the most influential group in terms of political leverage is not the business group or the capitalist group in the United States at all, but the unions.
Oh, no, see, my main interest is England. You cannot
Well,
be unaware of this.
I hope that we're in better shape than England, and please, I don't want anyone to
In that
misunderstand
respect,
me
you're
on
still a
unions.
little behind the English development, but I used to say, when I knew the States better than I do now, that in America, fortunately, the unions are just a capitalist racket. But it's no longer true.
Unions are part of the establishment of the United States.
Well, so they are in England, much more so. But they did believe basically in capitalism. But I fear this is changing.
In the United States, certainly, the unions have been much more flexible and less doctrinaire.
Yes.
And it would seem to me that no matter how one read history, in a free society, it's impossible to prevent people from meeting out of a feeling of their joint interests in order to...
Oh, I have no objection against unions as such.
Exactly.
I'm for freedom of, what is classical phrase, freedom of association, of course, but no right to use power to force other people to join it, to keep other people out. It's a privileges which have been granted to unions, in America only by the judicature, in England by law 70 years ago, that they can use force to prevent people doing the work they like, which is the crux, the dangerous aspect of it. And while I think unions are fully justified, but in fact I should support freedom of association. Yeah. Freedom of association means free to join and not to join.
Freedom of non-association.
Yes.
Yes. The one interesting fact about this is that the Communist Party tried to infiltrate the unions of the United States in the early 30s and the late 20s, and were quite savagely and quite successfully, and I think quite intelligently, kept out of the leadership.
Yeah.
This was to a much lesser degree true in England, where
right.
They don't call themselves communists, they say they're Marxists.
No, but they do want to destroy the present capitalist system.
And the stewards, or what we would call the foremen, are surprisingly candid about that in the responses in the polls, for instance. A friend of ours, Mark Abrams, who was also at the London School, did a poll in which he asked a group of stewards at one of the large factories, I think it was Leyland, which was in very serious trouble, was really bankrupt and was being held up by the government. He said, but if your demands are met, don't you realize it will wreck the company and that will wreck the industry? They said, but that's exactly what we want. I don't think you would find an American labor leader who's responsible who would say that or
certainly
feel that.
Wouldn't admit it.
Pardon?
I certainly wouldn't admit it.
No, I have the feeling you wouldn't have it anyway. I mean,
probably, yes, you're probably right.
That's why I said, to a degree, that the experience in England, to which I have returned often as a country I love, the depth of the class distinction, which is just beginning to disappear, has created degrees of bitterness which I've never found in the United States. There is a hatred.
See, my impression of England may be wrong in the sense that I only really know the South. And all you're speaking about is the north of England, where I think this feeling prevails. But if we live in London, and now my relations are mainly to the southwest of England, where my children live, I don't find any of this sharp, resented when the curious thing is that in the countryside of southwest England, the class distinctions are very sharp, but they're not resented. They're still accepted as part of the natural order.
That is so. And one puzzles about that, but as in all of these social things, you can make certain guesses. Are you impressed as you get older, as I get older, by the unbelievable intensity with which people maintain their beliefs and the difficulty of getting people to change their mind in the face of the most extraordinarily powerful evidence.
Well, one has to be if one has preached for, think, for 50 years without succeeding in persuading people.
You mean you still are the voice of the wilderness? Well,
Well,
you can
no,
hardly
no.
say that.
No, you see, I now in the habit of saying that while when I was young, only the very old people believed in the sort of libertarian principles in which I believe, and while I was in my middle age, nobody else did. I was the only one. I've now lived long enough to have the great pleasure of seeing things reviving amongst the younger generation, the people in their 20s and early 30s. There are an increasing number who are turning to our. So my conclusion is, I've said this I think once or twice already in these interviews, that if the politicians do not destroy the world in the next 20 years, there's good hope, because there's another generation coming up which reacts against this. But the chance that they will destroy the world in the next 20 years, I'm afraid, is fairly high.
The difficulty of contending with government power when even the press is dominantly committed to the faith or the ideology that you think wrong only increases the difficulties of the problem. That is, we do have a very, very free press, a free radio, and a free television. But the system which has produced the people who do the writing and the thinking and the talking and so on is such that your hope for a rise of the libertarians, let us call it, seems to me to be a faint one, given the opposition.
Well, I'm not so pessimistic as I used to be on this subject as a result of recent experience. And see, it has long been a puzzle to me why what one commonly calls the intellectuals, by which I don't mean the original thinkers, but what I've once called the second-hand dealers in ideas, were so overwhelmingly on the left. And there, of course, part sufficient explanation by a whole generation influenced by this has grown up. And I've long been convinced that unless we convince this class, which makes public opinion, there's no hope. But it does seem now to begin to operate. I mean, there is now a reaction taking place in that very same class. Meanwhile, even 10 years ago, there was hardly a respectable journal, either newspaper or periodical, to be found, which was not more or less on the left. That is changing now. And I seriously believe that this sort of thing in 20 or 30 years' time may have changed public opinion. The question is whether we have so much time.
When you think of the likelihood of a recession, which most economists say will happen, whether we're in it now or will happen in the beginning of '79, you think of the human responses to that recession. You think of the man and his wife and 3 children, and he's thrown out of work, and there isn't a job anywhere except 500 miles away, and it's in a different business and so on. Will you not have a revival then of feeling that the system has let them down? The system has failed, that again we are having unemployment, again we are having inequity.
There will certainly be a reaction of this sort, but I rather hope that for the idea of these systems, government will be substituted. I think people are beginning to see that the government is doing a great deal of harm. And this myth of the system, which is responsible for everything, can be exploded, and I think is gradually being weakened. I may be over-optimistic on this, but I believe government is now destroying its reputation by inflation.
Isn't that because inflation is the easiest way in which to meet the demands of the vested interest group?
At the same time, people do see that this is a constant concession to the expediency of the moment at the price of destroying the whole system.
Are you a complete monetarist?
in the sense that I'm absolutely convinced that inflation is done by government. Nobody else
By
can do
printing of
anything
money.
about it, yes. That I have no doubt. I believe Milton does oversimplify a little.
Milton Friedman, I should say,
Yes.
for the listeners, yes. Yes.
By concentrating too much on the statistical magnitude relation between the total quantity of money and the price level, I think isn't quite as simple as
Yes,
this.
yes, yes.
But for all practical purposes, we are really, I mean, our differences are fine points of abstruse theory, and but for practical purpose, we're wholly on the same side.
The inflation, the political uses of inflation are so attractive and so powerful. But as you say, people begin to realize that they're being gulled, that they're being cheated. That sure, they get $10 a week more, but look at how much more they pay in Social Security withholding and how much more they pay. Two things that astound me that parallel with the growing awareness about what inflation does. There has not been a growing awareness about the appalling shabbiness of official figures on almost everything. That is, the figures on inflation itself are outrageously underestimated.
The figures of unemployment, on the other hand, are blown up with an incredible...
Unemployment is overestimated because they ask a person if he's employed or unemployed, and the person says he's unemployed, and that includes many housewives who don't want a job or don't care about the job. But it's morally more justifiable to say, oh, I've been trying to get a job, than to say, who wants to work? But it's surprising to me that the figures on both of these very significant indices are continually being put out. The president has regular press conferences, every member of the cabinet, and no one says, tell us, how did you get these figures? And how much faith do you put in them? And can we believe them?
Well, and the thing is, do you read the Wall Street Journal?
Oh, yes.
They get all the facts very clearly put, and there is no effect.
When you were talking about the growth of new voices, the Wall Street Journal has become a national newspaper in a way that it wasn't. It was thought of as a trade journal. I often think that just as you might have chosen a different name for the road to serfdom, they would be better off if it wasn't the Wall Street Journal, because to the Midwest that already means bankers and so on. But also the rise of a magazine like The Public Interest, which has become influential far beyond its circulation and in the intellectual community. I was interested that one of your fellow Nobel laureates, who I think would be classed as a liberal, this is Paul Samuelson, in a column several years ago, I was quite startled because he raised the question as to whether imperialism really pays. He had been reading people like Hutt, I suspect, and Jukes, I suspect, and possibly Cairns, and he came to this extraordinary conclusion. He said, I would be hard put to know how to prove it, and explains why. And says, on balance, it would be very hard to say. He said, this is not to say that, of course, some Englishmen profit, but that on balance, whether the total input, as compared to where it might have gone, that this necessarily represented English interests as against Indian. He said, I couldn't try to make that case. And what he in effect says was, we really can no longer continue to hold that position, which was one of the great props, I think, of the socialist movement.
Well, you see, Samuelson doesn't really belong here. I think he's an honest person, and he's moving in the right direction. He probably started, well, I wouldn't say far on the left, but anyhow, it was predominantly what you here call liberal, I call socialist ideas, but he does see the problems. There are others who don't, even Nobel laureates.
Well, you were a co-laureate with a man who probably didn't agree at all with you, am I right?
Well, Myrdal, for
Gunnar
instance, the one
Myrdal,
with
yes.
whom I shared the press.
But he's not really an economist, is he?
Oh,
I
yes.
always thought of him as a sociologist because of his work on the American Negro.
He started exactly the same sort of problems I did
Is that right?
40 years, 50 years ago.
Which of the Englishmen do you feel, the English economists, are beginning to follow the pattern of re-examining the, what you call socialist, what I would call liberal tradition?
Well, there's no, amongst the young people, no single very eminent person, but the work being done by the Institute of Economic Affairs in London is, of course, absolutely first class. And they are so very good because they're taking up particular problems and illustrating on point after point how the thing, present system doesn't work. I think they have gradually achieved a position of very great influence indeed. And that is really the main source of resistance. It creates a coherent body of opinion, which is probably more important than any of the periodicals or newspapers in England do.
You had said earlier that with Schumpeter you agreed that one of the problems of the free market or the free society is that the economic base thereof, capitalism, arouses expectations it cannot fulfill. I wish you would comment on the passion or the drive or the delusion or whatever you want to call it, but the power of the movement for equality.
Well, it's, I think, basically a confusion. The idea of equality before the law is the essential basis of a civilized society. But equality of law before the law is not compatible with trying to make people equal. In order to make people who are inevitably and fortunately very different in thousands of respects, to make them equal, you have to treat them differently. So between these two conceptions of equality is an irreconcilable conflict. Material equality requires political discrimination and ultimately really a sort of dictatorial government in which people are told what they must do. I think the egalitarianism, well, I would even go further. Our whole morals are being based on our esteeming people differently according to how they behave. And the modern kind of egalitarianism is destructive of all moral conceptions which we have had.
Coming to that problem from an entirely different discipline, since I was in political science and political theory, two comments that in all of the debates on the Constitution and in the Federalist, the United States had a collection of political brains such as I think existed nowhere in history except in Athens.
Yes.
It was unbelievable brilliance, resilience, and flexibility. Two very interesting things. Nowhere did they worry about the growth of federal power. On the contrary, they were reasonably convinced that the states would be so jealous of their sovereign rights that they had to coax them into the Union and coax them and bring them in, dragging their heels. But the idea of a federal system, which has become a leviathan, so far as I remember, is nowhere to be found. It's one of the few examples in which their predictive activities were blank.
Yes.
Now, the equalitarian idea would have seemed to them ludicrous, because what they said was that it is in the kind of society that we're trying to form, with the very diversity and richness of life, of the farmer to till his soil, of the hunter to do this and so on, the awareness that they had of the fact that freedom would give people an opportunity to express themselves and live their kind of lives, even unto what they believed in or what church they went to or whether they went to church or not. None of them, incidentally, use the word God, you know. Well, I say none of them. There's providence, divine providence.
Well, the one who I think came nearest to seeing the danger of excessive power of federal government was Madison, the man whom I think most highly
He wrote
of.
the fifth, yes.
Yes. Oh, the others certainly you're quite right.
Yes.
Most of them.
He also saw he picked up the point of Aristotle about the middle class
Yeah.
in a most powerful way.
Oh.
Incidentally, it just occurred to me, we're sitting here talking, and I couldn't help but think how few economists I know with whom I can carry on this kind of discussion. In that sense, if I may say so, you are the unique. And I'm reminded of the fact that in the United States, there were not separate fields called economics and political science. It was called political economy. And it seems to me a great tragedy that the fields were split.
I agree, and I even more regret that there's a complete split between economics and law. See, in my time on the continent, you could study economics only as part of a law degree.
Yes.
And that was very beneficial. And I still maintain, as I once put it, that an economist who is only an economist cannot even be a good economist.
Well, I'm so glad to hear you say that. Incidentally, just as you mentioned the rise of a libertarian movement among the young economists, it's interesting how many new centers there are called the study of law and economics, or economics and law. There's one down in Florida.
I'm going there in February, yes.
I always anticipate you, or I'm behind you. Let me ask you this question. What do you think that, if you were talking to a group of working men who would say, well, these two, eggheads and highbrows, they talk on a high level, but I've got a wife and kids to support, and I can't possibly raise them on the salary I'm getting. It's a rotten society. We have moved 20 times. We were burned out, so the insurance didn't cover it, or whatever you want. What do you think a society owes, if you want to use that term? I'm not talking about the social contract, which was written by another very talented, but I think crazy man. What do you think the society owes those of its members who are law-abiding?
Well, owes, I think, is a somewhat inappropriate expression, but I think you can reasonably expect a tolerably wealthy society to guarantee a uniform minimum floor below which nobody needs to sing. The people who cannot earn a certain very low minimum in the market should be assured of physical maintenance beyond this. But I'm afraid even this cannot be generalized because only a tolerably wealthy society can physically do it. I mean, the Indians couldn't possibly do it. And many others.
You mean India, not the American India.
No, they are
India,
East Indians, yes. And the same is true of many of the underdeveloped countries. But once you have reached a certain level of wealth, I think it's a common interest of all citizens to be assured that if their widows or their children, by some circumstances, became unable to support themselves, they would be assured of a certain very low minimum, which on current standards would be miserable, but still secure them against extreme deprivations. But beyond that, I don't think we can do anything.
Do you say we can't do it because we really don't have the resources or the
No,
GNP
we
or...
would destroy the motives which keep our system going.
Yeah. Now, if people who were getting this minimum income, I should hasten to add, I'm sure you do not mean the minimum wage, which is a different animal.
on the contrary.
But if people could supplement that income by part-time work, handyman work, and so on,
that's all right. I wouldn't object to that.
you wouldn't deduct that.
No. I think for some... Well, most of the people I have in mind would really not be able to make much of an extra income.
Yes.
But if some widow who had to live on that small minimum income did take in some washing in addition, I just would not notice it.
Yeah. Well, you would certainly agree that I said, what does the society owe? And I feel that, in that sense, that a society does owe its people certain things. First, military protection in this world.
Oh yes, oh sure. That's
We
a
can't
different
go out
matter.
you can't go out and buy a few bombs and protect your house and so on.
Oh, in
We
time.
owe, the society owes, and the legislators and the people who have been elected freely,
That's what we formed the society for.
Exactly.
To get this protection.
exactly. And we don't want to be eaten by the nearby cannibals, whatever name they may have.
Yes.
Incidentally, you were surprisingly lenient, it seemed to me, on the Soviet Union in your early
And the
writings.
Russian serfdom.
Yes.
Well, you forget that it was our ally in war at the time I wrote and published it.
Well, what year did you come out?
44.
Well, this was just shortly after the execution of Ehrlich and Alter and the cutting forest and all of that. No, I'm not criticizing
We didn't
you.
know about these things yet. But see, in fact, I say it came out in 44. It was mostly written in 41 and 42.
I see. And you felt that it was unwise.
I just had to restrain myself to get any hearing. I mean, everybody was enthusiastic about the Russians at that time.
Yes.
And to get a hearing, I just had to tune down what I said
I
about
see.
Russia.
Yes, yes.
Well, no, that's, if you asked me before, was anything I would do different in the book now, apart from that it's directed against a sort of socialism which is largely abandoned by the official Socialist Party, I would certainly speak much more openly about the communist system than I did in that book.